Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I am joined by Dan Michelson, founder and CEO at InCommon and author of Holy Shift, Moving Your Company Forward to the Future of Work. Dan's personal mission is to help people, companies, and communities grow. In addition to his work at InCommon, he is an adjunct professor at the Quinlan School of Business at Loyola University. He founded Project Music, a benefit concert that sends children in need to overnight camp, and Hack Hunger, a collaborative of tech companies working to crack the code on hunger. In this conversation, we go deep into his book and his leadership experience as a multi-time CEO. He has seen, and we'll get into the details, a major shift in the way that we are going to need to approach work for the future, really, not even just for the next couple of years. But we talk about the shift that happens in past pandemics and how that's related to the shift that we're seeing happen today and what that means for how leaders and companies can be evolving their business practices, their cultures, and really themselves as leaders. We go pretty deep into what it means to take a human-centric approach to work, how to build connection, community, relationships, number of other things as well. Great conversation for any leader or aspiring leader. There's a ton in here that you can take away. There's a ton in Dan's approach that you can model for yourself. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly did. Here is Dan Michelson. Dan, welcome to the show. Excited to have you on here. I just finished your book, Holy Shift, Moving Your Company Forward to the Future of Work. And it piqued my interest because it aligns with a lot of things that I've been thinking about and a lot of conversations we've had on this show. So excited to dive in and unpack it a little bit. So welcome.
Yeah, well, hey, I appreciate it. It's a topic that means a lot to me and everybody else. So it's one of those unique things that once you start unwrapping, everybody has strong feelings. And I'm not sure many opinions. I mean, like people are trying to figure this stuff out. Maybe there are some strong opinions. I shouldn't say that when it comes to some of these topics. But I would say that everyone's trying to sort through it.
Yeah.
And that's really, for me, what kind of got me into it and got me down this path.
Well, I think a lot of people aren't quite sure what we're even sorting through. So let's start there. The book is called Holy Shift. What shift are you seeing and why decide to write a book on it? Like, what are you seeing that you said, oh, this is actually a shift?
Yeah, it's extremely personal for me, but I think work really is, at the end of the day, personal for everybody. I mean, I think a lot of times people say, don't take it personally, but everything is, right? I mean, if you have pride in your work and you feel purpose in what you do, it's going to matter. And so I'll try to keep this relatively brief, but, I had the opportunity over the last 20 years to be involved in companies that used culture and a sense of connection as really growth, essentially the growth engine of the company. So I was part of a public company. I was the chief marketing officer and chief strategy officer. We grew the company from 50 people to 5,000 people. So it was quite a ride. And everybody loved to work there and customers loved to work with us. But I would say, hey, listen, operationally, we had a lot of challenges along the way. So it was far from perfect. But really, that was essentially the secret sauce of the company. About a decade ago, I got a chance to run my own company. So not my own company. I was brought in. It was a 15-year-old company. They had 45% employee turnover the year before. So think about that. So a 15-year-old company with 45% employee turnover, that's pretty unusual. And over the next 10 years, I took what I had learned before, but also, sort of my ideal of what I think a workplace could really represent. And we turned the company into one of the top 20 companies in the world on Glassdoor. So the dream sort of came true from that perspective. But COVID hits. And initially, people reacted really well because of the things that we did. We were one of the few companies that didn't let anyone go, didn't do any salary cuts or anything. In fact, everyone got a 100% bonus at the end of the year. And those were things that we thought could happen because of the nature of the company. And we announced those things and that potential the first day that we pulled everybody from offices. So Initially people reacted really well, O'Brien. And then eventually the Great Resignation hits. It hit us harder, I think, than anybody else, just because people were so close. And when they saw their friends leave, they felt a real sense of loss and also a sense of burden because we were a high growth company. We grew this company from 50 people to 500 people. And so that means work was getting allocated to other people. And so all of a sudden our Glassdoor ratings dropped. And I took it incredibly personally, to go back what we were talking about before. And I'm like, holy shift. There's something really big going on here. And I found it incredibly intriguing and compelling and confusing and complex and all of those things, which are the things that typically attract me. So I was at 10 years of running this company. It was a private equity backed company. We had sold it to a public company 7 years ago. And I needed a new challenge. And I'm like, listen, this is as complicated as a thing as you could possibly take on. Let me give it a shot. And so really that's what got me into it. And as I started doing research on this, I did research with close to 2,000 CEOs and about 100 countries and 40, 50 different industries. And everyone was coming back with the same thing. There's this crisis of confidence when it comes to company culture. And it's no surprise. I mean, people had become very isolated. And as you probably know, isolation and depression have a direct correlation. So the reality is once you started looking at this from a real-time perspective, what's going on in companies, and then also from a historical perspective, which we could talk about, this is the single biggest and fastest change in how we work and live in human history. Of course, it's going to be complicated, right? Mm-hmm. And so what I was trying to do is to take a big step back. I've been involved in strategic planning for well over 20 years, that if you were going to hand a strategy to a senior team or to a board and say, here's a structure that's data-driven that you can follow, that's what I want to come up with. And that's really what the book is all about, is that journey. It takes you basically through 3 steps. The first step is seeing the shift, so understanding what's changed. The second is shifting your mindset, because to solve any problem and take a new approach, you have to think differently. And the last one is to make shift happen, right? So you got to set things in motion to really drive change.
I love that. So from what you were studying, from all the CEOs you talked to and the history that you looked through, what were the biggest takeaways for you as far as what was shifting?
Well, there's really 3 things that have happened. There's 3 major shifts. One is we've shifted from what I refer to as factory mode to something called flex mode. So factory mode is really for the last 100 years, really all through human history, you had to be work at a certain time in a certain place, right? That's how work was defined. School is defined by you got to be here at this time and in this place. And that has recalibrated in such a massive way. That's really the first one, is we've gone from what I call factory mode to flex mode, right? You can do work anywhere, anytime. And that applies to school as well. So Brian, my daughter was in college at the time. She actually was a very good student, did well. She didn't spend 1 minute in the library for 4 years in college, right? And that wouldn't surprise anybody. So work isn't just about a time and place. That's the biggest shift that's taken place. The second one is we've gone from, I would call it workflow, where all our life revolves around our work, right? And now people are calling it work-life balance or work-life integration. I call it life flow. The point is you can't separate work in your life. You don't have a work life and a home life. You have one life. And people need to acknowledge that and understand that in order to really address it. So that's the second one. And then the third one, which is a really big deal, is that work was always about this collective experience. So, for me, I prided myself on building a culture where people felt accepted and respected, right? We were all under the same roof. That was relatively easy to control. And really what's happened is, and this is true in a college setting, like I was just referring to before, in a company setting, or even in a community setting where you live, it's not like you're spending time, if you work at a company with 5,000 people or 500 people or 50 people, maybe 5 people. So really someone's experience in work is about them and the circle of people around them. And that's a really important concept to understand. So as a CEO, you might think, hey, we can put these initiatives in place. And as an HR we could try these tactics. The reality is it's really about that person and the people around them. That is what defines their cultural experience at your company. And that's been going on for a while, but now we've put it on, turbo, right? So in our research, what we found is that pre-pandemic, about, let's call it 1 out of every 5 people in the world was primarily working outside of an office to get their job done. Okay. Now it's 1 out of every 2. So that's a pretty big concept, so even if you bring people, let's call it, into the office, a couple of days a week, still they're doing a lot of work outside the office. You have to acknowledge that. And turns out the majority is that's where it's taking place. So work isn't anymore defined by the 4 walls that you walk into, or a time or a place, right? This concept I was talking about before, and that's really the first time in human history that's true. So those are the 3 big shifts: the individual experience, going to from workflow to life flow, and from factory mode to flex mode.
Thank you for sharing all those. One other question I have from the beginning of the book is, you had talked about studying other pandemics, and I love the saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. What did you learn from studying past pandemics?
To me, mind-boggling, right? I guess I'll bottom line it. Bottom line is, we've been here before. So if you go back to the bubonic plague, 1 out of every 2, arguably maybe 1 out of every 3 people in Europe died. And so what to do? Well, you basically had a worker shortage. So what happened? Well, people started trying to get people to come work on their land, the land of the Lord, right? And people had worked on in the same place and space for generations. So this isn't a small thing. This is a big thing. So it turns out that the average wage during the bubonic plague was 300%. And people started moving from one place to another. So job mobility, and they started offering them other benefits. So the first labor movement in human history was caused by a pandemic. So that may seem so distant to people that they can't relate. So let's go back 100 years. So 100 years, you had the Spanish flu, and 1 out of every 50 people in the world died, right? So you had the same kind of thing going on. And what happened during the 1920s? What happened during the 1920s, partly as a reaction to that, and partly as a reaction to coming off World War I, is there was a women's labor movement, right? We needed other people. And so it turns out the first woman governor was elected during that time period. And that's when you started seeing lockouts and strikes, right? Really for the first time. So once again, pandemic, labor movement. Now, what happened back in 2020? Same kind of dynamics started to play out, right? Where people wanted to bring people back to work, but others, were kind of hesitant to do that. And so the exact same patterns from a management perspective and from a worker perspective all came into play. And then we saw this huge pendulum swing, which is fascinating to look at. So if you go to the Great Resignation, all the power swung to people, from a labor perspective, and you had people leaving for 30 to 50% raises.
Yeah.
And then, a year later, you had people laying off 10 or 20% of their company due to overhiring or whatever, kind of explanation you want to kind of ascribe to it. And power swung back to the people in charge. Well, guess what? Historically speaking, like you said, history rhymes. So the pendulum will continue to swing back and forth. Now, the thing that I kind of come back to is, like, what is the thing that really kind of describes your company or defines your company? Everyone always says it's their people. So the companies in this moment that are really going to be able to distinguish themselves and take advantage of this moment historically and in real time right now are the ones who recognize that and take advantage of that and do something about it.
I love that. And I thought that was fascinating. And we had chatted a little bit before we started recording here about what you're reading right now. And you had mentioned, I don't really read business books, but I read a lot of psychology books and human behavior books. And there are a couple investing blogs that I follow, and they don't really write about investing a lot. They write about human behavior and decision-making and risk management and all that kind of stuff. I find that interesting, surprising no one, because I have a podcast on human behavior. But I think it's interesting to look back and see that these same reactions are the same reactions that we are experiencing. I guess a question for you on that is, okay, what happens after that? Do these things settle out? Do they swing all the way back? Do we just kind of like settle into a new normal, or is life like forever changed for the future, and the companies that don't adapt eventually, shrink?
I'm not sure they shrink and die. I think they're gonna have challenges, right? So no, I mean, listen, life has changed forever. It has historically, right? So what followed the bubonic plague was the Renaissance. What followed the Spanish flu was the Roaring Twenties, right? So there is both a personal and a professional reaction to chaos and conflict. It's very predictable. That's the one thing that you learn from studying this stuff historically, is that we could have expected this. In fact, we should have. Now, the question is when there's a change in business, well, it could be a regulatory change, it could be a competitive change, right? How do people in leadership react? Well, they're supposed to absorb that, understand it, communicate it, and then action it, right? And that's what you do. The problem in this case is people have fought it. So when you think about flow, it's really hard to swim upstream. It's really easy to swim downstream. People were swimming upstream when it came to this. And what you found is that the people who run companies and the people who work for them were at odds with each other. In fact, they were, I would say the best word to use would be in conflict. And because of that, the number one tool that you have as a leader or a teacher or a coach or a manager was ripped away, which is trust. And because of that, people became very transactional and transitional regarding work, so of course I'm going to leave if all I have to do is click 3 times to show up at another company. Why wouldn't I? You have this kind of inherent conflict, and people have now thrown different terms out, which I think are very disingenuous. And I think they're actually very off, like quiet quitting. So when you study terms like this, you got to look at the data. And if you look at the data, it turns out, this has always been a problem. It's actually nothing new. So if you look at the Gallup data, they said half the workers are quiet quitting. Well, if you studied the data 10 years ago in 2012 and 10 years before that in 2002, it was identical. So
it's just disengaged, right? Isn't that what
and that's a management problem. That's not a worker problem. If the people who work for you or the team, let's say that you're the coach of, or the class that you have as a teacher, would you blame it on the students? Well, I mean, the best teachers, the best coaches, the best managers, the best leaders, of course they wouldn't do that. So once again, this distance was fairly predictable, right? It's happened historically. And from a psychology perspective or a sociology perspective, however you want to look at it, I actually think it's kind of an in-between part of that, which is social psychology, right? That's what I think was in play here is, of course, terms are going to go viral. Of course, people are going to take anecdotes and use them for explanations. All that stuff was really predictable. But if you see beyond that, listen, everybody wants to and needs to feel like they are doing something of substance when it comes to work. And your job as a leader or manager is to help that, is to help bridge that gap. So really kind of getting back to the book was written not to just kind of point out what's happened historically, but to kind of think about, okay, we got to think about this differently. How do we shift our mindset? And then what do we need to do from an action perspective? How do we make shift happen, right? How do we set things in motion that will make a difference?
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to sit with a group of special operations veterans and hear a bunch of stories about their career. And it was a really interesting evening. And 2 of them, one a Navy SEAL and one a Green Beret, both told stories about the first time they got shot at in combat. And the one guy, I remember, he said shots were fired. Everybody around him dropped to the ground but him. And he wound up standing there. And he said, the thought in my head was, what do these clowns think they're doing shooting at me? And it was like, he couldn't believe that somebody had the audacity to shoot at him. And then the guy next to him grabbed him and pulled him to the ground and said, you're going to get your head shot off. Get your ass down. It just was such an interesting story that even this guy who had gone through all this training, his brain in the moment couldn't reframe to register that danger was real right in that moment. Now, he was able to recalibrate quickly and get back out to it. But the reason I tell that story and the question I have for you is, it is hard, especially when things happen quickly, to recalibrate our view of the world, to reassess the beliefs that we have, the image that we have of how the world works. It sounds like you made that adjustment pretty quickly, maybe even pre-pandemic. How do you do that for yourself is part one of the question. How do you constantly say what needs to be reframed here? And then you have a team of people as a CEO around you. How do you help them reframe the world as well?
Well, it's such a good story and such a good example and such a good question. So if you're asking it directly like you are about me personally. And I wrote a little bit about this in the introduction of the book, so I'll get really personal here for a second. One of the things that I talk about is if I have any whatever superpowers or special skills, it's really two. One is I'm pragmatic, kind of like to see things for what they are. And two is I'm optimistic, right? I think things can and should get better. So that is how I view the world. Now, the reason for that is, maybe a little contrarian to what you would think. So when I was about a year old, my father walked out on our family. And at the time, it was me, my sister, and my mom. So I was a year old. My sister was 3 years old, and my mom was an unemployed school teacher with $200 in her bank account. So not a great way to start. With that said, I was fortunate in a way that he actually didn't want to stay part of our lives, which once again may sound counter to what I'm going to share. But so he stuck around for a couple of years kind of reluctantly, but I haven't seen him since I was about 11 years old. Now, with that said, my mom got remarried a few years later to a screw salesman from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And we were, I think, very distant from each other. And really, I personally had a lot of things I needed to work through and kind of get over myself, for lack of a better term. And that began to happen in my 20s. And then we really started to form a relationship. And by the time I got married, he was the best man at my wedding. So the reason why I say all of that is kind of explain the difference between being a father and being a dad. There's a big difference. And because of that experience, I became a much different parent, I think, than I would have otherwise, right? And I don't really think I missed a moment with my kids who are both in their 20s because of that lived experience. Now, I say that because, optimistic, right? Like, hey, something bad happens, something good can and maybe potentially will follow. So I'm not talking about being positive, right? Which is like looking at a negative and just trying to turn it around. I'm just saying, hey, listen, you can go through something really bad and it can end up being something better, right? And then practical, which is like he didn't leave me and my sister, which is how you feel when you go through something like that. And it's something you carry really for your whole life. This is 1969. He had his own issues, right? And some people just don't want to be a dad, but they're, take the step of being a father, I guess. So just be practical, see things for what they are. So, when I got a chance to run a company, really that had been part of me since I had this experience growing up. And, when I look at things that happen from a business perspective, and this is, to some extent, maybe the biggest, most challenging change that we'll ever go through from a company or corporate or business perspective, right? This is a pandemic. It was pretty radical, right? I kind of get excited. I'm like, boy, this is a big challenge. I'm actually pretty excited about it. And what can we do in this moment? So you lean in and, people need leadership. They need communication. They need authenticity. They need caring. So we basically we were one of the first companies, I think, at least in the Chicago area, to pull people immediately. But we reached out to people and we said, hey, listen, two things. One is safety of your team, safety of you and your family and your friends. And two is supporting our customers, because we were a healthcare technology company. Our customers were going to be hospitals, and they are hospitals, sorry. So they were going to be on the front lines of this fight. And I'm like, oh my God, what an opportunity to really be part of the solution, and really support those who are serving, so like, I think you can find that uplifting message, whatever you want to call it, comeback story, right? People love to climb onto that, or you can just go with the flow and burn down the house. Personally, because of what I went through when I was growing up, I really was raised as a contrarian. And so like, if things are bad, I want to see the good. And if things are good, I actually many times try to say, okay, well, what can go wrong here? And how do I flip this, so I can prepare for what might be on the other side.
Yeah. I like the reframe of optimism as not an overly positive view of the present, but a belief that the future can be better.
Or a belief that you can work through something. Like once, I do think that a lot of people talk about this relative to parenting right now, that keeping their kids out of any kind of, let's say, loss, right? Where something bad happens to them is the worst thing that you could do for them. But as a parent, that's your instinct, is to protect, so it's an instinct you definitely have to fight. But I think we all know that. You gave an example of the Marines. I gave a personal example from family. Whatever it is, when you go through something that's really challenging, you take something from that. And I think that is a lesson that all of us learn eventually. And to your point, the question becomes one of framing. It's not like it's a good thing when something bad happens, but it's something that can help you grow. There's no question about it.
Yeah. So how do you teach that to others? Because in the book, you had the quote, "Maybe it's time we let the old ways die." And I like that quote, but it made me think of Planck's principle. Are you familiar with that?
No, tell me about it.
So he was a German scientist, and he said, science progresses one funeral at a time. And I have heard that translated into the business world, culture evolves one retirement at a time. And so you seem to be blessed through your experiences and maybe some innate traits to have this pragmatism and this optimism and this drive, and together they allow you to shift. But a lot of people find that to be very difficult. So how do you work with the people around you to help them through that so that they can be the leaders you need them to be now that things have changed and you don't have to exit them from the situation?
Well, the reality is, in any company or any setting, people do follow the lead of a leader, right? Negatively and positively. So I think, privilege of leading other people is recognizing that you are going to have an impact on them, right? So I don't think it's just about setting the example. I think that's part of it. I do think it's maybe more important to reinforce it, right? So if something bad happens, you lean into it and you get behind people and you have their back. So I think a lot of us who've been working for me over 3 decades, who've been working for a long time, have had people who've stepped up in our darkest moments. Would be one example that I would share with you. Like, let's say somebody really messed up or something went really wrong. The things that I remember the most in my career are when those things have happened, the people who've stepped up and had my back, right? And so there's an example of actioning, leadership. So there's a quote I used in the book that I borrowed from somebody else, but it's the best quote on leadership I've ever heard. You and I were talking about books before. I was friggin' obsessed with books on leadership and people who were leaders, and mostly because I never thought I would be one, right? Because of some of the stuff I went through growing up. I was incredibly insecure, I didn't think too highly of myself or about my future at all. So optimism wasn't there yet. I would say it's definitely been a learned behavior, and I'm still on that journey, I guess. But at the end of the day, what is real leadership? What does it mean? And I've talked to a lot of people, like, what's your definition? You get definitions all across the board. Honestly, I didn't have one of my own. I could just, on a given day, I would probably bring up different examples. But then I was listening to this podcast one day, and this guy said his definition of leadership. I was actually on a jog. I stopped, listened to it like another 3 times, typed in every single word of it. I'm like, oh my God, this is finally it. What he said, he was asked to define leadership. He goes, what a leader does, leaders make people and situations better. And I'm like, aha, that's it. So it's not about a title. It's about making people and situations better. It's about action. So to answer your question, to kind of loop back there, O'Brien, I would say, listen, it's all about the actions that you take in a situation like that. So the number of things that we set in motion with customers, with employees, the care that we showed to people individually, the relentless level of communication that came from us, the acknowledgement that there was so many things that were uncertain, but here's the things that you can count on. So the clarity was there of what we didn't know and what we were or weren't going to do. And, the fact that, hey, things could change, and recognizing that instead of being defensive about it, being very upfront about that. And you saw a lot of companies as they went through this did exactly the opposite. They said, okay, listen, we think in maybe 2 weeks, if the numbers get to this level, we'll do this, or, hey, we want people back 5 days a week, or, they just jumped the gun. And so they had to change and change again and change again and change again. on everything that they were doing, and they lost the faith of their team and the trust of the folks that work for them. So I hope that, I know it's a fairly long answer to your question, but I think it's as simple as taking action, right? And really putting things in front of people. So changing the attitude.
Yeah. Well, and acting on your values is kind of what I hear you say.
And I don't want this to sound the wrong way, but that's the reason why I wrote the book, right? Is because of acknowledging what you said. I think this is going to be a hard thing for people to get their heads around. I think it's really hard, and it should be. So what I want to do is to take a easy button approach. Like, if you want to radically simplify this, what would you need to do and how would you need to do it? That was really, what my goal was, because I don't think it's easy. I think you're right. Some people are not going to change, but just like anything, you can't be absolute about it. So unless everybody loves it, or unless everyone changes, no one changes. No, you work at a portion at the time, but you are completely right. Some people will age out. Other people react very defensively to what's going on, and they have. So these are all kind of not essential, but very much parts of human behavior that get repeated.
Yeah.
When anything of scale comes up, that's really challenging.
Do you have any kind of a practice for yourself for thinking about the world and what's going on in a moment? Do you like any kind of journaling practice or reflection time, or were there leadership meetings that you would have where you would discuss the state of your business? Any kind of did you put into any processes into place to help you constantly be looking and reframing?
The one thing that I do very consistently is run. And that is, for me at least, meditation. And I would say roughly 99% of my kind of clear thinking comes in moments when I'm introverted and alone and reflecting, as opposed to collaborating or trying to work through it with others. So that might be different for someone with a different personality. I'm more of an introvert. So I get my energy by listening and thinking and then processing. I think somebody else would take a very different tactic. So I don't think my approach is necessarily right for everybody, but I do think there's a lot of noise. And the question for anybody is, how do you get away from that noise? And the noise mostly referred to is the noise in your head, and there's no question that you can look at this from a clinical perspective. The impact of exercise on depression, right, and mental illness is pretty significant. So if you were going to do one thing, that's a good place to start. And, and obviously it has spillover effects for maybe a business problem or personal problem you're trying to work through. That's how I've approached things.
Yeah. And I know that these questions weren't in the prep that I sent you, but it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down, because I think it is so hard for people to pull out of their worldview and reassess things. I think just the way our brains work, we create frameworks and structures and biases and an image of how things work. And that's how we get through our day, because then our brain says, oh, I know what's going to happen here. I recognize this pattern. But when those patterns change, it can be so hard to change with them. And so I think if you can harness that skill in some way, it really can become a superpower.
Well, and also it's very much like, to some extent, the scientific method, right? So if you were to look at any type of research, really it all goes through a very similar pattern, which is community, like what is everyone else saying? Universalism, like is there a truth here, or is one that needs to be questioned? Anyways, so on and so forth. And I think if you have a little bit of organized skepticism around you, either within you or around you, like I do think a lot of people, when they go to other people for advice, all they're looking for is confirmation. And so, you have to actively invite people in order to say, hey, O'Brien, here's what I'm thinking. Can you make the opposite argument? Right. And
I like that.
And there's really good techniques on that are incredibly effective. So I'll give you one example of how this works. So, or a different technique. So let's say you're bringing a group together, and there's going to be dynamics in that room, whatever group it is. It could be family, it could be friends, could be at work. And depending on who's in that room, it's going to be a very different room. And then you say, okay, we have to make a decision on fill in the blank, A, B, or C. And the first person who talks obviously is going to have a fairly big influence on what follows and how they say it. And then, maybe the pattern that goes around there will be established based on prior interactions between everybody in that room. Now, what kind of decision or what kind of information is going to come out of that type of group? Now, to counter that, what if you did the same thing, but before you did it, you polled everybody individually and you pulled their opinions or their ideas out. And then you asked them to present them. Everyone got 2 minutes each to kind of share their perspective. How different would that room be? Of course, the dynamic would be dramatically different. So I do think that people follow patterns clearly. And in order for us to rethink what's going on now, we have to change our patterns. And so that's probably the biggest thing is pushing against that process, that inertia that exists within every company. I mean, very basic concept, right? But objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest. So it takes a force of nature to change that. And really, to me, that's the job of a leader. So I think people, may have a title in a company that connotates leadership, but it definitely doesn't define it. And I think that's what we're seeing right now is, in times of chaos, confusion, and conflict, leaders emerge. Right. And so I think you're seeing who really are truly leaders versus maybe those who just have the role.
So I want to pull us all the way back out of that rabbit hole and get back to kind of where the conversation was going before I diverted us. And you had mentioned life flow. And I think we can pick back up there and how we need to recognize that we only have one life and everything is integrated. So how do we create a more human-centric approach to business? What goes into that?
Well, it turns out the more human-centric you make your approach, the more productive people are, the more engaged they are, and the more likely they are to stay.
So let's define that then. What does it mean to have a human-centric approach to your workplace?
It's really two things. It's number one is community. Does someone feel a sense of belonging? So let's just see, kind of use that a college analog or a community analog in terms of someone living in their neighborhood. If you're connected to the people around you, you feel part of it. If you don't, you're not. And so it's very easy to leave a college if you're not connected to anyone. Really hard to leave your friends. Very easy to move from one house to another, one neighborhood to another. Very hard to leave your neighbors. Really hard to go from one job to the next, because you're leaving your people and connections behind. And really easy if you don't have that. So the human connection really is the strongest play that you have in terms of how people work and terms of how they feel, right? In terms of whether they're engaged. And the second one is just the quality of those relationships. It's a really simple test. Are someone's relationships trusting or are they toxic? When you have toxic relationships at work, how that weighs on you personally is profound, right? During the day, at night, on weekends, it's never ending. When you have trusting relationships, it's amazing how that elevates what you can do from a work perspective. So I do think strategically, it's just maybe the simplest thing that you can do is to recognize that reality and leverage it.
So this is the second time recently that relationships has come up on the podcast. I interviewed Megan Lally, who's the CEO of an advertising agency called High Dive. And they built their agency on the tenet that better relationships make for better business. And they realized that they would do better creative work when they had better relationships with their clients and within their team. And they really designed their whole business around that. And they've exploded and they do super cool Super Bowl ads and all kinds of different things. So how do we do it? What goes into creating connection? How do we foster that in a workplace where we're trying to figure out hybrid, virtual, in office, and the balance between those things? Like, what are the key elements that actually create us feeling connected to somebody else or our people feeling connected to each other?
Well, the good news is there's a very specific way to do it, and it's been done since the beginning of human history. Every relationship begins exactly the same way. On the surface level, you're uncovering or discovering what you have in common. So you can think of people as two individual circles with a Venn diagram waiting to happen. So where are you from? Do you have kids? Where'd you go to school? People are often surprised, after a few minutes, like, oh my God, I can't believe we had so much in common. It turns out that actually isn't magic. It's just math. So what we've been doing at InCommon, the company I run, which ironically is named InCommon, is
see what you did there,
right? Is understanding how to automate that, given the fact that people are operating in really one of three scenarios primarily. They could be remote, they could be hybrid, but they might be in person. And if they're in person, a lot of these workforces are very distributed. So someone's experience of meeting people, they're only meeting a handful of people, really, or spending time with a handful of people anyways. So you can think of a company as a neural network to an extent, right? And the stronger the connections are between people and the more connections you have, the stronger and smarter that person will be individually, right? But also the organization collectively. So there's a real strategic reason to focus on relationships. It's not just a nice to have, it actually is a need to have. So imagine an employee at your company, O'Brien, who's connected to 2 or 3 other people. Okay, compare their experience to somebody who's connected to 20 people. Who's going to learn more? Who's going to grow more, right? And who's going to have a bigger impact? You would answer that immediately. So the math problem we were trying to solve at InCommon was how to recognizing that people aren't together as much as they used to be, right? And maybe in some ways they never were, or at least weren't that much. How do you automate that? How do you make that happen automatically? So what we've really done at InCommon, and I'm just using this as an example, there's other approaches that you could take, is asking a series of questions. What we found out is by collecting somewhere between 10 to 15 data points on somebody, they will have at least one connection with 99.9% of people in their company. It's kind of like if you've ever heard of 6 degrees of separation or 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever. People are always surprised, hey, you're only 2 steps away from whatever the president of the United States, 2 degrees. It's not surprising. It's just math. So same problem with connecting people within a company. So if you can automate that and take that first 15 minutes of a conversation and make it happen in a millisecond, and you can look at each other, O'Brien, and hey, you're a runner too, or if you have a dog as well, or you're into street art, or you're a gamer, or you're into artificial intelligence, right? These are things that you can, 1, connect people on, and 2, bring them into communities of people that they have things in common with. So relationships, once again, start at this surface level. That's the pattern. But the real relationships, so just because we have those things in common, O'Brien, we went to the same school, we live in the same neighborhood, maybe we have some of the same friends, doesn't mean we're going to be particularly close. So the second step is really going below that surface to substance. And that only happens by diving deeper. Maybe some of the things I shared about my family earlier, right? And some of the things that I've been through would help people relate to me because maybe they've had similar, challenges or issues. And then sharing experiences. So that's where within a company, even if you have people remote, even if you have people hybrid, bringing people not back, but together is essential. And nurturing meaningful experiences when they're together is absolutely essential because that's how those relationships are going to form. Once again, very specific pattern, surface and substance. You have to follow that pattern if you're going to have deep, meaningful relationships.
So the analogy or the imagery that pops into my head when you explain that is having something in common with somebody else opens the door. Being willing to share and be vulnerable invites you into the room. And then it's the shared experience that you have that determines, how rich that room is decorated and how much you enjoy being in there together.
Absolutely. And you can turbocharge that. Like, let's just say you're in a group of people who are completely strangers, right? And you ask that question, have any of you ever had breast cancer? Anybody who steps forward at that point will feel instantly connected. So it's really about experiences at the end of the day. That's the single most important thing. But like you said, you cannot open that door, right, without 1, sharing information, and 2, being somewhat vulnerable. That is absolutely essential.
And one of the things that I found just in my own experience, is that while shared experience is great and does create relationships, the strongest relationships are created through the hardest experiences. So you think about military veterans and, the strong bond that they feel for the people that they went to combat with. I mean, even a fraternity pledge class who has to go through hazing, and be up early in the morning. Like I went through that experience, and I remember feeling super close to those guys. You see it in sports teams, the more they struggle together and grit it out. Remember the Titans is like the best example, from a football movie of how that struggle brings people together. It can be hard to do that in the workplace, though. We want everybody to feel good and feel positive about the environment they're working in. And yet we know, or at least I believe, that some of the best relationships and some of the best skill building comes from being put through really difficult situations. How do you think about that as a business leader?
Well, I agree with it. I do think that, you're going to have different relationships scattered all throughout your life, and they shouldn't and don't need to be all the same. The question is are those relationships trusting relationships, right? And if you believe kind of what I said before, which is, hey, the more relationships you have, the stronger your career, and the more you'll grow and the more you'll learn, then there's a real career strategy in terms of building strong relationships, but there's also a really big company strategy in terms of doing the same. So if you think of it from a branding perspective, right? So someone's experience with a product is how they're going to grade it. And someone's experience with an individual is how they're going to grade it. Now, we know this from the hospitality industry. If something goes wrong in a hotel, okay? So you have two different experiences. One is everything goes perfectly. Second one is something goes really wrong. Which one are you going to grade better? Well, it turns out I'll give you a third scenario. Something went bad, but then they had a recovery. And when you got up to your room, it was either upgraded or they had a bottle of champagne, or someone came by and knocked and just said they sincerely apologized and gave you free dinner, there. It turns out what Ritz-Carlton and others have discovered is that the third scenario is the best. So what they did is they gave all of their employees the autonomy to spend, I think at the time, this was a while ago when there was a case study on this at Harvard, but about, let's say, $150, somewhere in that range, without asking it for anyone's permission. They could do it immediately. And you can see, like a place like Ritz-Carlton, obviously they care about service quite a bit and their reputation, but it does lay claim to kind of what you're acknowledging, which is like when people step up during hard times, that's what strengthens relationships, right? Like exactly what I was talking about before. Some of the worst experiences I've had in my career have strengthened relationships more so than any single thing that I did throughout my career. And I feel very loyal to the people who were in leadership roles who stood up and had my back, when it felt like they didn't need to. So I do think what you're saying is very real. But the question is now how do we foster that? So if people are in different situations and settings, can you bring them together to work on things that really matter in moments? So one of the ideas that we used at my last company, which there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal about Smucker's does the same kind of concept, but which is having core weeks. So you might say, okay, I want to have two people and people come in 2 days a week or 3 days a week. Well, what if we just brought in the entire team for 4 days, 1 week a month? And during that week, we divided it out into different types of experiences. So maybe there's shared experiences in the morning, but in the afternoon, everyone can go off and do work, and continue to have opportunities to collaborate with each other, but this time in person. So there's different ways to think about how to use time and how to use space that could facilitate exactly what you're talking about, more of a shared experience. I can't say that it'll always check the mark on being a really tough or bad experience that they need to work through, but at least it builds the relationship. So then when those things do happen, now you have the trust, now you have the relationship that you can lean on to help propel yourself through that moment.
Yeah. And you don't want every experience to be bad either. So I hope that wasn't the impression I gave off before. But I think not being afraid to put people through something that's hard, or to encourage people to take on things that are really hard and support them through it. I think that's important.
Yeah. We had a thing where we decided that anytime we had a big customer issue at my last company, and just to give a little bit of a frame, we served about 80% of the hospitals in the country. So this is one of the larger healthcare information technology companies in the world. We would get excited about it. We're like, hey, this is going to be a great learning opportunity. So we kind of got that DNA going, and we would reach out to the customer immediately and just say, whatever it is, we own it. And we would set the right frame. But for the person who was, let's say, a relatively junior level person who was working on it, we would just say, just so you know, we are right in front of you on this. We're not behind you, right? So if it escalates, we've got you. If anything goes wrong, it's all about us collectively. And we would communicate to them in that moment when they were kind of most concerned. The client was screaming the loudest, and it really set a tone, for that type of approach within the company. And the one thing that I'll say, and I'll add to that, is for 10 consecutive years, we had the highest customer service level in the entire industry for healthcare information technology. Actually, I should frame that for analytics companies. So it really does work in terms of leaning in when things are really challenging.
What percentage of the population, or especially the leadership population out there in the business world, has this skill set, this empathetic, this like EQ, experience, design, human-centric skill set? Like, how prevalent do you see that today in the business world?
Boy, what a good question. Hard to judge. For the people that I come across, I would kind of almost put a line down the middle. And also, I don't think it's necessarily for every leader. I do think that it's for running a modern company, there are a lot of reasons why you would say that EQ is super important. But you can see other leaders that are really effective, and they don't really have that skill set. So, some other strength that they have balances it out. But if I had to bottom line it, I would say somewhere around half. I mean, I do think there's a lot of leaders who do have that skill set. Now, whether it's promoted or kind of supported within their company culture, I don't know. But from a leader perspective, I do think, one, it's probably a spectrum. There's probably people all along the spectrum. But if you had to divide it out, I would say, at least in my experience, roughly half.
It seems to me like there's a huge opportunity. And like EQ has been one that's been talked about for a while. But the one that I've been really fascinated with is this experience design skill set, and realizing that people want a different experience, right? They want to experience community and connection. They want to experience these relationships, and that you can actually foster relationships by designing better experiences, and that like you can actually be proactive in doing this stuff. And it seems like that that skill set hasn't quite caught on yet. I don't hear a lot of leaders talking about that. I hear more talk about experiences mattering, but less about that actually being a skill set that they can develop as an organization or as individual leaders. And I'm just curious what your thought is on that, because it's something that I've been fascinated by.
I think you're spot on. I do think it's ultimately all about experience, right? So when someone works at a company and you say, well, what was your experience? That's the definition of what you're trying to hit as a leader. What's your mark? What's your target? And so one of the things that I've talked to a lot of leaders about, because they have struggled defining culture other than our people are great. And I'm like, all right, so let me give you a slightly different angle. What if I said your job as a leader is to help make this job the best job they ever had and the best place they ever worked? And they go, yeah, that sounds about right. So that's more actionable than saying, hey, we want to have a high NPS score, or we want to go out and promote an award that we want to try to convince people that this is a great place to work. But the other thing, and this is going back to something we talked about earlier, is we've got to recognize that you can't manage it collectively. You have to manage it individually. And this is where companies are really constrained, because 70% of someone's experience at a company is driven by their manager and the relationship with that manager. And so if we don't give the training and the tools to managers to really evolve and become more coaches, for the people on their team, you're never going to get past, those issues. It just won't happen. So yeah, from an experience design perspective, if you were going to go, you would just say, okay, well, hold on. What experience is it that I'm actually designing? You would say it has to be that manager or that small circle of people around them and the experience that they have within their own, once again, circle of their time at the company.
Yeah, I agree. And I just see leadership, coaching, and development as just one of the most underutilized practices that's out there. And it could be really expensive, so it's hard to invest in it. But I just think the ROI on having really great leaders at all levels of the business is huge.
Yeah. Well, can I counter you on one of the things you just said?
Please.
I don't think it's expensive. I don't think it's hard. I think it's super simple. I think the
all
problem.
Right, let's have it then.
Yeah. So one of the things I wrote about in the book is the difference between a coaching mindset and a manager mindset. A manager's mindset is you work for me. A coaching mindset is we work together. So, Brian, I'm going to challenge what you just said just a little bit. And,
Please.
I don't think it's expensive. I don't think it's hard. I think it really is more or less about mindset. So a manager mindset is you work for me. A coaching mindset is we work together. That is a huge shift in how you look at what your role is and what you're doing. Because a lot of people get into a manager role and they think they have to be omnipotent and omniscient. They have to be all knowing and all powerful, and they're not. And so they operate from a place of insecurity. And it often causes a real challenge in terms of like an evaluation mindset in terms of how I'm working with somebody, right? I'm evaluating them. I have power over them. And therefore they're serving me as opposed to the other way around. So it starts with, okay, let's switch from managing to coaching, but let's talk about what coaching is. So coaching is a very specific thing. It's about giving someone guidance versus giving someone direction, right? So if it's a coach on a team, you can tell someone what to do to some extent, right? But ultimately, they have to make real-time decisions of what's happening, and then you have to coach them back on what just occurred. Second thing is you, as a coach or as a teacher, let's call it in this case, what you're really trying to do is find someone's individual superpower skills. Like, what are they really good at, and promote that, as opposed to say, well, you're not good at this and you're not good at that, and this is where you need to develop. Those things may be true, but if you can really leverage the things that they're great at, that's what a stronger coach would do and get them in a position, for lack of a better term, to win. The third one is you got to be aware of what the things that you're doing and how you can improve them. A real good coach says, hey, these are the things that are going on that you need to be aware of, and here's how you can adjust or course correct. A manager a lot of times takes over for that person because they're responsible for their performance versus giving them the autonomy and the ownership to pull it through. And then the last one, which is huge, it's just this idea of real-time feedback. A lot of people, once again, are in this evaluation mindset. I'll sit down with you once a year, and that's when I'll tell you if you did or didn't do something well. I mean, it's the equivalent of a coach of a team saying, okay, the season's over, O'Brien. Let's sit down. In that third game, in the second quarter, I really wish you would have done this. And that, as ridiculous as that sounds, that is exactly how a lot of people give feedback or coaching to the people on their team. Those are all things that you can action just through education and awareness, and through reinforcement over time.
Yeah, I love those. Those are all great, actionable pieces of advice for people. Well, we are out of time here, but I do have one last question for you. And it's a question that I ask a lot of our guests, which is, what in your mind is the purpose of business?
I do think it should be additive, right? So I don't think it should just be whether that company succeeds or doesn't within its own individual context. I do think there's a contribution that you can make through your product or your service to make people or situations better, right? So let's say you're an advertising company. Yeah, you can put things out that are really meaningful that can drive action towards something. You can be a service company, and let's say you work in a hospital, not just a business, obviously, and people would say that, but in many ways it is, and it has financial requirements and constraints. then naturally you would look at that and say, well, okay, well, that is incredibly important in terms of the compassion and passion that someone has towards serving people. But products are the same way. Like, you want to design something that actually makes a difference and people love to use. So if I was to put it into a nutshell, I would say the purpose of business is to improve the experience of those that you serve.
I love it. I love it. And that brings us full circle here on a wonderful conversation. Dan, anything else you want to share, or places you want to direct people if they want to learn a little bit more about what you're doing or find the book?
Yeah, to find the book, you can go to any online or other bookstore, or you can just visit www.theholyshiftbook.com. And to learn
with
more
an
about,
F, Holy Shift with an F.
Yeah, very important to clarify that. So Holy Shift, theholyshiftbook.com. And if you want to learn more about the company, it's just incommon.com.
Love it. Well, thank you. Hope this was helpful. A ton of great wisdom in here. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, O'Brien. Appreciate the opportunity.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.